Live. This is the beginning of the show where I whisper now because StreamYard likes to make me sound super loud. Welcome to CASAA Live, everyone. Yeah, we're here. It's Saturday. We're going to do the darn thing. I saw a lot of people in chat already. Skip Murray, first one in, says, I'm ready. We're ready too, Skip. The Dolphinum is here. Welcome. Professor Milky is here. Mallory Gates, welcome. John Haymaker in chat. Adrian, Philip, Christy, Jeremy, everybody is here today. Welcome, you guys. Thanks for joining us for another weekly CASAA Live. We've got some special guests that'll be joining us here very soon. We've got some legislation to talk about at the end of the hour. Alex, what do we have for legislation this week?
We have on deck kind of the same old at this point: Colorado, Hawaii, and Rhode Island.
Ooh, all good news, right?
Sure.
Why not? All good news. Well, I'll wait for Kristen to get back from her midstream jog. Oh, okay.
I'm unplugged. I had to plug my computer in because somehow I became unplugged and I was running out of power on my laptop.
There's been this ongoing joke about this corn song in my house this week that's called Coming Undone. And like we've just been walking around like randomly singing this one line, and you were like, I'm undone here. And I don't know. That's just really funny to me in a weird way. Anyways, we'll move on from this. We're going to get our special guests in here in just a moment. But really quick, I'm dying to know, hey, how are you, Kristen? How are you this week?
Good. I think everything's been good.
Good.
Nothing unusual. My oldest son finally got COVID, but he's fine.
You sound almost relieved. You're like, finally, he got
COVID. It's like he's got it. It's mild. He should be good. He's 32. He's healthy in general and all that. I mean, in Chicago, how are you not going to get it, right? I mean, but he was the last family member to get it. So it's like, and he's fine. It's mild, it seems like, and he's getting over it. So then I can kind of like, he was like double boosted and all that kind of stuff. So it should be pretty mild. But other than that, nothing too exciting this week.
Well, I hope it isn't severe in any way, and I hope he gets through it really quickly. Yeah, for sure. Knock on wood over here. I'm boosted to the max, and I haven't gotten it yet, and I'm still kind of waiting for like my own finally moment, So I feel you there, Alex. Hey, how are you, sir?
Good. It's finally springtime up here.
Yes.
And we went to a new bar in town last night.
Ooh.
And I met a gentleman who was very curious about what I do for a living, and also the same gentleman is opening an Indian restaurant here in town, so we're gonna have a little bit more flavor, which is great.
Cool.
So,
yeah.
All in all, last night was a success.
Adults don't like flavor, Alex. We all know this. You're not gonna go to that restaurant for flavor.
I'm gonna eat the shit out of that menu.
Telling him what you do makes me think. I'm really quick, sorry, but telling him what you do for a living makes me think of what goes around social media sometimes. Say what you do for a living, but say it in a really messed up way of describing what you do.
Tell me what you do without telling me what you do.
But in a really they said specifically like in a messed up way, like
Oh yeah. I just tell people I play in the dirt because that's basically what I do.
Yeah.
More or less. That's the roundabout way of it. But anyways, yeah, all well here. It's spring, finally. I've just been super crazy busy, and that's my hey, how are you? For anybody who's been trying to reach me this week, I've just been working. That's it. It's spring. It's go time for me and for the company I work for, and busy stuff. But anyway, without further ado, I know people aren't here for all of this. They're here for our guests, so we're gonna get right into it. Is everybody ready? Are you guys ready?
Alex got to say something though.
Alex has Alex has words before we start.
I have words, and
I'm new here, you guys. I'm sorry.
So the topic we are going to be talking about today, of course, is Prohibition and Jacob Grier's article that was made free to read this week. And so I think it's appropriate to maybe set the table a little bit here with an introduction from CASAA, which is that CASAA does not endorse or encourage people to break the law with regard to making, selling, or consuming nicotine. However, considering the negative consequences of overbearing regulation and people's desire to avoid the disease and early death of smoking, we cannot condemn it. And with that having been said, let's talk about illicit trade.
Sweet. Let's talk about illicit trade. And joining us this week to have this discussion about illicit trade, we have Mr. Jacob Grier back with us. I think Jacob is our first returning guest.
Oh wow, that's great.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So
right.
welcome back. We don't need any more introduction for Jacob. We'll just move right. Jacob, really quick for everybody here. Give everybody a real quick rundown of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a freelance journalist in Portland, Oregon. I write for a bunch of websites, most prominently, lately at least, Reason Magazine, which is a libertarian magazine that hopefully a lot of you are already familiar with. Had a big story in there on the new issue, which I've actually got it right here because I just love this cover. It's called, if we can see that, Save the Butts. This was this just worked out very fortuitously, where Elizabeth Nolan Brown, who covers a lot of sex work issues in the same issue, has a great article on the trying to take sex off the internet. And I had my same article on tobacco. So we realized this was an opportunity to put them both on the cover with this great tagline, which I love. And also,
save the butts.
Yeah. And I've got a book that, of course, I have to plug. That came out in 2019. I know you guys have read it, The Rediscovery of Tobacco, all about the history of tobacco regulation with a big case for harm reduction in vaping.
Yeah, fantastic book. Thank you again for joining us this week. And we also have Amelia Howard on with us. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome. First time guest on CASAA Live. Yes, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, real quick, give us a rundown of who you are and what you do.
Well, my name is Amelia. I came into this space working on a PhD thesis on the history of vaping innovation, and then just sort of fell into advocacy. And these days, I would sort of consider myself a forever advocate. I'm a part-time consultant for law firms that work with independent e-liquid companies, very part-time. I'm not sure if I'm going to go back to doing my PhD or to find another way to publish the research that I've been doing. And so, yeah, actually, this is my first kind of foray back into discussing vaping in a public forum for a little while. Yeah. So I'm excited about it. And Prohibition is a great topic. And Jacob's article was fabulous. So I'm just really glad to be here.
Awesome. And we're happy to have you here.
Right?
Thank you. I do vape.
And you vape.
Of course I do.
Yeah, Amelia asked us before the show if she could vape on stream. And we were like, yes, but you have to do it obnoxiously loud and directly into the microphone. Just because not only does everybody in chat loves vaping ASMR, but it is Alex's favorite sound in the world. So yeah, thank you both for being here. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm gonna hand the floor over to Alex, just because he worked tirelessly on this show. So I'm gonna hand the floor to him, and you can kick off this conversation, sir.
By tirelessly, you mean casually.
Yes.
So
when you got around to it,
which is par for the course for me. But yeah, a lot of this is the impetus for having this show now is obviously the article being published for everyone to read, but also some discussion that this has kicked off among proponents of tobacco control and people who are more in favor of tobacco harm reduction. And so I think once again I'm sort of back to this table setting, and the first question is, are we actually using the word prohibition appropriately here? Because there has been some discussion. It seems that depending on who you are, there may be a sliding scale of what prohibition means. And so maybe to kind of get into that, are we being hyperbolic here, or is it appropriate for us to use this word?
It seems very appropriate to me. I mean, there's always degrees of prohibition, but and obviously, I mean, you can make the argument that we haven't prohibited everything, but whether you're talking about individual prohibitions on stuff, and when you get into what's going on with nicotine policy, I think that would be absolutely apt. And I think that, when you get an in-depth look at it, like Jacob did in his article, well, what else would you call it, really, at this? They're prohibiting things. So I mean, it's a kind of prohibition, isn't it? Like, that's a strange argument to me in some ways. Although I can.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very strange when people try to deflect away from bans on whether it's menthol cigarettes or very low nicotine or banning flavored vapes and saying that it's not a prohibition when it clearly is. And I think that's just a rhetorical move because prohibition has such bad undertones to it. Instead, I would shift it and say that sometimes prohibitions can work. And like an example I gave recently is lawn darts. I don't know if you remember these, but these were the sharp, pointy darts that you throw in your yard, and it's a very unsafe toy, and people died using these darts. And the government stepped in and forbid this product, and but there was no big illicit market for lawn darts after that, right? There's not a huge demand for lawn darts that people are going to go underground and seek them out.
Right. We don't have tens of millions of lawn dart users actively seeking these products.
Right. Yeah. There's not a guy in the park, outside my apartment selling these from a trench coat. Right. And so I think the factor is, how many people use these products and how robust is the demand for them? And, when it comes to smoking and vaping, like here in the United States, we've got somewhere around 34 million smokers. I've heard estimates of around 10 million vapers. That's a whole lot of people. And as we know, nicotine is very hard to give up, and depending on how you use it, especially with smoking. And so is this tension when people say in tobacco control that smoking is incredibly addictive and hard to give up, but also if we ban it, there won't be any black markets for it. I think that's a very naive view.
Sure. Yeah. Obviously, when we ban things, they just cease to exist. The demand goes away.
Right.
People stop using the products. The illicit market doesn't exist. Yeah, sure. Yeah. That's usually how it goes.
Well, it's interesting. Like, I was too far away from it, but I bought my husband a bottle from, I have a cottage in PEI, and I bought an island in Canada. And I bought him a bottle that was actually from where we live and where we both grew up in Kitchener-Waterloo. And we had a whiskey factory here. And it's antique, and it had made its way to Prince Edward Island, and Canada never had full-on federal prohibition like they did in the United States, I believe. But we certainly had areas of Canada where there were prohibition-style laws, and it was basically impossible to get liquor. And the island I was on was not one of those places. However, the back of this bottle has a whole prescription on it. And so you had to have a doctor order you a bottle of booze at that time, kind of thing, in order to get it there. And so, yeah, were you allowed in some way to consume alcohol during that time in Canada? Of course you were. Was it a lot easier than in the States? Of course, but I would still sort of consider that like a prohibition era thing. Because if you don't have access to sort of like the person that can get it for you, or if you can't get it for yourself, like, it was just hard for the average person to get. And I think at that time, for me, that's the line that we can start to call things prohibition, whether it's good or bad. If there's a restriction on legally accessing a product, then you are prohibited from doing that.
Yeah, when consumers can no longer go and just buy these things, and it has to be through a prescription model, or it's medicalized or something like that. That's kind of, you do start to kind of veer into that realm of prohibition for sure. Absolutely.
They seem to want to always say we're not banning people from vaping. I mean, that's what they always seem to fall back on when they pass these laws and stuff. And we're not banning possession. We're not banning people from vaping, but they don't explain that they're banning everything people want to vape. So, or just about everything that people want to vape. So I don't understand where this disconnect is with that.
Right. It becomes like a de facto prohibition.
Yeah. We're not banning, you can vape. We're just banning all the flavors, and we're only leaving you with, 2 devices that one's not sold anymore. It's like,
and I kind of see, Philip Kirschberg dropped a note in here about someone preferring to use the term abolition.
Oh, Ruth Malone,
which sort of reminded me, one of the things that I am sort of fixated on is there's this dissonance between the sort of fine print stated policy goals of like Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, or even CDC. And I think this may be a universally accepted kind of definition of the end of the smoking epidemic, where smoking prevalence is below 5%. So when you're talking to serious policy experts and researchers on the side of tobacco control, they're, I think, somewhat open about the fact that we're never going to get use down to zero. But the dissonance that I mentioned is those policy goals don't match the campaign slogans that we hear, which is tobacco-free generation, free, free, free of all of the ills of society. And so, it seems a bit like people are misled to believe that we're going to solve this smoking problem by getting rid of all tobacco, and yet the people promoting that message don't actually believe that. And I understand, this is how we campaign to get things done. But I guess if this is eventually going to be a question, I mean, shouldn't I'm trying to stay away from should, but can we get to some sort of middle ground or better understanding for the public better understanding this issue? If we can moderate that tone. I mean, we're accused of being uber libertarian. We just want these things sold on every corner, and we fire back with saying, you want to reduce use down to zero. Is there not a way for us to come together and have a more sensible conversation about it?
If we can step back for a second, I'd just like to, since we brought up the term abolition, just think that we should push back on that a lot, because I think it's actually very offensive. Because when you say the word prohibition, you think of alcohol prohibition in the United States. And so that's why people in tobacco control want to move away from that, because that's generally regarded as a policy disaster. But then they try to shift the terms to abolition. And what do we think of when we say abolition in the United States? We think of the abolition of slavery.
Slavery, yeah.
And one, I think it shows how little regard they have for people who smoke or vape, that they would make this comparison to such a horrendous period in United States history. And it shows how they view smokers and vapors as just having no free will. Like they essentially view them as being enslaved. So I think we should absolutely push back on that. And I think it's a terrible analogy. And we should always push and say, no, this is a prohibition, and you are infringing on people's liberties to do with what they will with their bodies.
I mean, it's that kind of sort of carelessness and carefulness with language that I see a lot in tobacco control. I'm sure there's other sort of quasi movements, academic fields that might do the same thing. But even I think he started to talk about that Robert Proctor anyway, started to talk about that concept in depth in his book, which is called The Golden Holocaust. And I also remember thinking, okay, I do think it's important that for ethical reasons and sensitivity reasons and political reasons, and also just realistic reasons, that you don't frame people who use a drug as just having no agency and being good slaves to tobacco is sort of that is their sort of idea of this. And it really shows how out of touch they are with the population they claim to be speaking for and protecting, and also history. And it's a huge problem. And I actually hadn't thought about that specific term in that way. He writes an article a year about abolition with Ruth. I'm pretty sure it's the same article.
For those listening, Jim McDonald in the chat wrote, Proctor co-wrote the recent article with Ruth about abolition. Yeah. That's what Amelia was responding.
I mean, Proctor. I used to really like Proctor, and I thought he had more of a radical sort of idea of this than when I read him more carefully now. He does. He does seem like he's very enamored by certain heroes in tobacco control and has sort of adopted their assumptions. And so then when this plays out around vaping or other kinds of nicotine, I do think that Proctor is correct, or anyone is correct in their analysis of just sort of the physical components of a cigarette and how dangerous the design of a cigarette makes cigarettes to people who use them. I think that's absolutely correct. And I do see a case for, not necessarily through legislation, but I do see a case for, moving towards safer products in future generations. But
Jim said he seems like a straight.
Yeah, I'm just like, I almost read it out loud because I do it does sound a bit crazy. Anyway.
He seems to have veered in his path then, his ideas. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not as familiar
I don't know if that's maybe
Proctor,
just the polarity of this conversation, where, just to get back to what Alex said at first, where you're sort of framed as you're framed if you're pro vaping or even just pro. You shouldn't be framed if you're pro something like freedom. Like, I've always considered myself pro freedom. That does not make me a libertarian. I'm of course very sympathetic to libertarian like principles and stuff, but like the idea that, you know, valuing freedom and agency and the ability to make decisions on your own in things that are risky or somewhat risky or benign, like that's not, like, to me that's always been a straw man argument. And then so in countering it, it comes down to how do you counter straw man arguments, and I have not been good at doing that, and I don't know really what the technique is, but I think that's a very intentional thing where they sort of frame, you know, there's the moderate liberal progressive tobacco people, and then like the libertarians who say this, and I don't think that's a great accurate description of people that are pro harm reduction for tobacco users or pro tobacco even. Like, it just,
yeah, for sure, a false
dichotomy. But I don't know how to counter it. So.
Yeah, a false dichotomy with no appreciation for the nuances in between, and certainly you know, the appearance to most of us is that this is largely driven by people who want to control things. They feel as though they are the puppet masters and have the best way for us to live. And really, it's just, you know, we actually do have agency, and we do want to choose things that make our lives better. So yeah, I as I mentioned, I casually put these notes together, so kind of flipping around here and relying on things, you know, moving along. But you know, we can't talk about prohibition without talking about underground markets or black markets or illicit trade, as I mentioned at the top. And so, you know, we certainly have recent research on the effects of flavor bans. Massachusetts, I think, probably the most well-known example. But Australia is having its moment. It seems now. This seems to be reaching a bit of a fever pitch. And I saw some quotes in here from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. It's their ABC. There was an article, illegal vape and tobacco trade booms across Queensland amid bureaucratic buck passing. And one of the things that I hadn't really thought about was that sellers on the underground market can use nicotine products to test smuggling routes. And you know, we one of the things we talk about with, you know, there's an example, I believe, from Massachusetts of someone who was arrested, is going to be sentenced to 5 years in prison. This person was selling illicit drugs. I don't know if there was illicit alcohol in there or untaxed alcohol, and flavored vapor products. And so you know, it's sort of the birds of a feather flock together, right? Where someone is selling one illegal product, certainly others are going to be sold as well. And I'm sort of curious, between the two of you, Amelia, I know that you're paying a lot of. I don't know if you're paying a lot of attention to the research now, but in your experience in researching this, are we starting to see that more and more? Is there anybody even really looking at this about the crossover of products within that illicit market?
I mean, I actually haven't read, besides there was some discourse like a while ago. I mean, it's just sort of around. I've always seen the connection with weed and with cannabis products. Most of when I see stuff like that, it's not coming from researchers. I actually think that would be a fascinating, I mean, not even just for nicotine policy, but just in general, like the interest, like just seeing, where drugs are coming from and how markets grow in absence of a legitimate one. But I mean, where I sort of see this thought about and not necessarily thought through and talked about and not necessarily in a strong way is in like children's or teenager education programs or anti-drug groups, where they really do sort of, I actually always kind of assumed that it was more of a fabricated market in their mind, but I guess now that you do have real prohibitions on this stuff, somebody's going to bring it in from somewhere. Sorry, that's not really an answer to your question. Like, the truth is, I don't really know if this is being looked at. It's slightly counterintuitive to me because oftentimes what happens is it will be some of the same characters, although maybe vaping has made it past a stage where the industry is simply too professionalized for people to go back into a gray market. And so for them, it's kind of like they either fight for it and they get it, or they'll exit completely. But yeah, no, I haven't heard much about that. I don't know, Jacob, do you know more about this? Or?
I haven't heard much on a formal level. I did talk for my article to Richard Marianos. He's a really interesting guy. I believe he used to work for the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms Agency in the United States, and he now is teaching at Georgetown. But yeah, this is one of the things we talked about in our conversation is that, especially with regard to cigarettes, he's talked mostly about just high tax rates in states like New York, driving trade down to Virginia, where people just stock up on cigarettes in Virginia, bring them back up to New York. Yeah, and he's talked about how that's actually just becoming a more lucrative line for people who were previously doing drugs or are still doing drugs, or doing, I should say, selling, maybe doing too. We don't know. we don't want to assume. But they're getting into it's just expanding their potential business line, to have this option now, and that's just with taxes. So obviously, it will get worse if we go to like full prohibition.
And I mean, you bring up a really important thing. We've talked about this quite a bit. I mean, New York is the sort of shining example of the failure of excessive taxation on these products. But one of the things that proponents of high taxes on cigarettes, for example, is one of the things that they push back on is the sort of patchwork of tax regulation that we have, and that most illicit sales as a result of high taxation occur because of the differential between neighboring states. Or not even really neighboring. Virginia's 12 hours from here, so not really close. Well, it's a little close. I'm at the tippy top of New York. So but even with all of that, I mean, what confidence should people have that if the entire United States had a uniform New York state tax on cigarettes, that would solve the problem?
I would say low confidence, and the reason I say that is mostly the experience of both Great Britain and Australia, who have attempted to institute these policies, both of which have the advantage of being island countries, and in the case of UK, much smaller than the United States, and yet smuggling is still a huge issue there. So if we're in a much bigger country and also have 2 land borders, I think our odds of controlling tobacco through just high taxes are pretty low.
I also think I think it was David Sweener who explained this to me. Is like, it's pretty well known that there's a bit of a law, like the law of diminishing returns kicks in with taxes. Like when you first introduce a tax, it can reduce rates down. And I think there's sort of this, we'll just do what we've always done because it's always worked. And there's, you can kind of be blind to it not working. The thing is that gray markets, black markets, illicit markets, informal markets, whatever you want to call them, are notoriously difficult to measure. So what we even know about these markets is probably a very conservative estimate of how much, business is going on. I think Canada is a good look. I'm not sure how our tax compares to New York State, but it is quite high. And people who smoke go to reserves to buy cigarettes, and that will always be there. I don't see a legislative mechanism that could impose the same restrictions onto reserve cigarettes that you can on cigarettes and convenience stores. And yeah, it does reduce rates, but then you get people who will always do it, and whenever there's a way to get it, you can. And so, yeah, like at a certain point, taxing just becomes completely unproductive. But I think that there's so much faith in a lot of these policies, and there's so much romantic thinking about, like, well, if we just try it and it's going to be different this time, and and I think that really comes to the human element and the emotional element in any kind of a policy field like this one, where you do have a public health problem. You do have people that sort of see themselves as heroes or champions of the people, and you can be prone to making bad decisions and thinking it'll work out well because you have good intentions.
Sure.
Yeah,
this is something that I see a lot, because I live about 20 minutes from a native reservation, and when I smoked, that was where I went. They were $19 a carton compared to $10 a pack at the store. And everyone that I know personally in this area, my friends, my coworkers, people that I know that still smoke, everyone goes out to the res. Nobody buys cigarettes here in the state. Nobody goes to the gas station to buy a pack of Marlboros. They all smoke, cigarettes from the reservation. And so, when I'm at the store and I actually see somebody buying, a product off the power wall, it tends to be a can of dip or chew, or even Juul pods or something like that. A lot of people here aren't buying cigarettes off the shelf at the store. They're just going out to the reservation and get them. And then if you just take that idea across state lines, whatever, I mean, that's one of the biggest reasons New York has such a high, illicit market for cigarettes, is because our taxation is so high. I don't know what it is now. It's like 5 something a pack or whatever it is here.
It's almost 5. It's like 4. I think it's
4. Oh, ours is higher than that. Jeez.
Yeah, and then I think in the city it's actually over 5, right? In New York City.
New York City has a minimum pack price. I think the minimum price is $10, and then you get the local and state and federal tax on top of that. So it can be $15.
Even worse.
Yeah.
So, I would note, for anybody who travels through southern Quebec, we take a sort of a southern route south of Montreal in order to get my father-in-law's house, and it's right along the border or through First Nations land, a reservation there, and which I believe actually straddles the international border, which has, as far as I know, was recommended to somebody that if they needed to sell their product in Canada, that the people on the reservation could get it there relatively easily. But it's a really fascinating strip of it's all smoke shops. And it's kind of funny that, they've all appropriated intellectual property. There's Starbucks. There's another shop that is clearly using like the NASCAR logo, but it's in Canada, right? So maybe they're out of reach, and it's on First Nations land. So it's really, I haven't stopped there for any, I don't smoke anymore, but it's always just a really fascinating thing that Quebec, of course, which has, I believe, the most restrictive anti-smoking policies, anti-tobacco policies in all of Canada, that contrast of, that southern route below Montreal and then going anywhere else in Quebec, you can't see the product. It's so strictly regulated, and of course Quebec has, I believe, the highest smoking prevalence in all.
I was going to say, it surprises me that they have the most, and I believe that now, actually, just seeing the way they've addressed vaping, and I know that they've kind of done both, but Quebec is where I used to go when you couldn't smoke inside anywhere else. And I was like, an 18-year-old dick
I just assume that's the French influence,
as a
right?
kid. And, you'd go to Quebec to like be able to drink and smoke inside. You were too young to do both here. So.
I looked into it once, and I looked at the various states that had the highest taxes and compared it to what their smoking rates were. And it is undeniable that the states with the really high taxes do have low smoking rates compared to a lot of our states. But what they don't talk about is that some of the states with the lowest taxes have very low smoking rates as well, compared, like Virginia, I think, is one of those outliers. Is it Virginia? Yeah, I want to say Virginia. And I think a lot of it has, if you look at the different states too, a lot of those states that also have had the high taxes also have the most wealth, because you're looking at things like West Virginia or Tennessee or whatnot that have the lower taxes. They also don't have the same wealth that you see in California and New York and Chicago. And so that's going to affect the smoking rate. So whether or not the smoking rate was affected by the tax or education and such like that, which is what we saw, was smoking dove the most dramatically right after that first Surgeon General's report. It was education. But wealth helps, because if you're wealthy, I'm going to take a vacation and learn and quit smoking. I'm going to go get a massage instead of having a cigarette. I mean, there's certain privileges you have. And then the taxes also lead to things like people selling loosies and like with what Jacob's article started off with Eric Gardner, which is one of the things that I always point to when these people come out and say, oh, we're not doing anything against these. This is all against businesses. None of this is against people. And they seem to forget that the people who buy these products that they're affecting the businesses with. And so I love that you told that story, Jacob, that first line in your article. What do you have any more thoughts on with the Eric Gardner situation?
Well, yeah, I think anytime you expand the scope of police activity, this is the risk you run. And so if we extend bans to menthol cigarettes, then or to flavored vapes, then that's going to become a matter of police enforcement. And that's one of the things that's frustrating to me is a lot of people in tobacco control, when they talk about this, say, no, it's like you said, it's just about, affecting the tobacco companies, or it's just about the retail shops. And we're not actually going to go after individuals. And I think they're just extremely overconfident in the idea that you'll be able to control this trade just by, affecting the current producers. Because yes, Altria probably has too much to lose to keep selling menthol cigarettes in the United States, but smugglers don't. Right. And individual small dealers don't, and people who can buy cigarettes and buy a gallon of menthol flavoring don't have that much to lose. So yeah, I think this illicit trade will certainly come up, and then they're going to have to face that trade-off of, do we enforce the law or do we allow this trade to happen? And if they enforce the law, then there's going to be more incidents like that, and more people being arrested and more people going to prison.
Or getting tased. And
I
so
was just
far,
going to say, maybe we just enforce the law with tasers. Maybe that seems to be.
So far, we've only seen minority teenagers get affected by these laws, and they seem to not be able to make the connection that by telling all their little exaggerations and outright lies, in all honesty, to pass these regulations on businesses, they're misleading little towns and big towns and city councils into thinking this is this horrible product that you had to ban industry and do all this stuff to industry for. So now that means we need to have outdoor bans for vaping at parks, which then in turn ends up affecting normal everyday people who are using the products, not selling them. So they don't seem to see that connection between the stuff that you're saying in order to get your desired effect against industry does end up trickle down effect. It's like a Reaganomics of vaping. I don't know what else to call it, but you know what I mean? So you end up with people getting tased because these city councils think that this is this horrible thing and it's this horrible addiction and all this horrible stuff because of all the crap that they said in order to get their flavor bans and their taxes and all that kind of stuff passed.
There's also, just to get back to Jacob's comment on the overconfidence in the idea of how much you can control. That was something that I sort of, if I can speak just slightly personally about just my experience with people in tobacco control when I first started meeting people that work in this field, coming to it from a very different kind of university, like environment where, you know, sociologists don't try to control how people behave or what they use or whatever. Like, we're more just interested in like what people are doing and the meanings behind it and how that socially plays out. And so I found people who are relating to this sort of stuff in such an abstract way, and in such a like the way that I might play a very complicated video game or like Settlers or something, where, you know, there's this sort of collection of activities you can take and this and that, but they, you know, I think it was a real shock to the system of this entire field to even have people that all of a sudden care about their work. And I can say I didn't care about their work when I smoked cigarettes.
I see what you're saying.
Because I was just kind of like, whatever, you know, and I'm already doing this in sort of this dumb, rebellious, young way. So like, I don't care. But with vaping, it's sort of like you suddenly realize that there's this whole field of people who, you know, like are playing this sort of game, like they get to control things and try different things, and they just don't see any human face to it. Or when they do, it's sort of this mixture of badly interpreted and badly collected statistics and metrics, and then this like fantasy image of like the pure victim or like the helpless smoker and the evil corporations and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, one of the things that's really bothered me for a long time too is this refusal to sort of differentiate on an empirical level or even just sort of like a political level, the difference between multinational corporations, no matter what the hell they make, and, you know, a shop owner. And if you do want to get, like, even when you do sort of enforce this on industry, if we're talking about people that make money off selling the product, I think one of the things that, I'm not saying anybody necessarily in this chat or watching this show might think, but what does get forgotten when it's the vape shops that are going out to fight this, and also sort of like the network effects that happens in terms of who speaks out and who gets to be spoken for and blah, blah, blah. But like, you know, the people that own smoke shops and convenience stores and stuff like that, where like, I buy my vapes now because that's where I can get to. Like, those are, you know, new Canadians for me, or like, in, you know, these are like just dinky little smoke shops that are suddenly like, you know, when during the Juul panic, these places were being raided by police for like, just for like a news story. Like, I don't even know if they were doing anything illegal at the time, but it's just, when you open that door for enforcement, it is always targeted at the people that won't be in a position to make it a problem for the police, and that's the problem.
The little guy, basically.
Yeah. And there was an example of that I mentioned in one of my recent articles that also happened in Massachusetts. It was a small town, New Bedford, and apparently someone tipped off the police that menthol cigarettes were being sold in this small Latin American clothing store. And if you look at the photo of the shop, you know, not to make assumptions, but it looks like a very small, like not particularly well-off shop. And the police staked out the shop, waited to see somebody leaving with Newport cigarettes. Then they went in, they raided the shop, they arrested the guy, and they made it look like a drug bust. You know, they took a photo and posted it online of, you know, the cigarettes and the alcohol that they had, because it seems like the guy might have been, you know, selling Coronas and like small pours of rum to his, you know, customers as well. But yeah, they arrested him for it, and that's, you know, the type of things we're going to see if this policy gets more widespread.
And the irony is, the taxes that they were losing probably didn't, from this little bit of sales, probably didn't even make up the amount of tax dollars they spent of ours to do that whole stakeout and that whole thing.
Right.
Yeah, drug bust porn is just awful. Like fanning out your $5 $20 bills that you got out on the table, you know, the handful of Juul pods and like the quarter of weed that like, you got, you know, we're really cleaning up the streets. We're really making everybody in the community safe. We're doing it for the kids, but in reality, it doesn't matter, you know, how many, low level folks we bust on the street and throw in prison for selling drugs. Like, it doesn't matter how much of that we get off the street. It has zero effect on the trade, it has zero effect on the illicit market in terms of quantity that comes in of whatever it is. Even when you see these huge drug busts where they stack bricks, they're building a wall of cannabis or whatever, it has no effect. And it's just, I don't know, it's awful. And I just hate drug bust porn. I just hate the fanning of like $20 bills on a table. It just disgusts me. It's really,
I don't know
really
if you
awful.
guys noticed that when they do these things now, a lot of times it'll be a tobacco shop or a convenience store that also sells vapor products, but the headline, it seems to say vape shop. Have you noticed that they do that a lot now? It's almost like a concerted effort to like malign vape shops. I've just been noticing this trend, and I'll go in and look at it. I'm like, that's not a vape shop. It says tobacco store, and vape is like written at the bottom of the sign, and the headline says vape shop raided or vape shop busted for this, that, or the other thing. It's like,
I started
even murders,
to see that
even something
actually,
else that
like,
happened
when
that
I
has
was
nothing to
doing-
do with that.
Yeah, when I was doing media analysis on the Juul panic, I definitely saw that. And I saw a lot of things misrepresented as a vape shop, like bong shops in particular. Part of me wants to kind of give the benefit of the doubt to local news just not knowing what the hell they're talking about, or not necessarily knowing, like, because there is a difference between a tobacco shop and a vape shop. I don't think one is better or worse than the other, to be honest, but there's obviously like a difference. If you've been to like a legit vape shop, it is not like a tobacco shop at all. But I also just don't think that the people that are covering this necessarily know, and that they might just be doing that because they think that's what it is.
Well, it's just funny because you'll see the company
Joe's
the
Tobacco.
picture right underneath the title. It says tobacco store, and it says vape shop. Murder at a vape shop. Or
I will
vape
add
shop
just to this conversation that with all these policies, with all these restrictions, with everything going on, there are a lot of businesses that are simply diversifying.
Yeah.
There are vape shops that are moving into the more traditional tobacco product space. There are vape shops that have moved very heavily into the CBD, hemp, and cannabis space as well. So that line between vape shop, tobacconist, glass shop, all of those things, those lines are getting really blurry. And that's a direct result of these policies and people simply diversifying to survive, to keep a business going, to feed their families, whatever the case may be. I've talked to a number of shop owners who had to, couldn't get product anymore for whatever reason, through policy, whatever, and had to make decisions to start selling cannabis products, hemp products, glassware, things like that, just to keep the lights on. And so I will just, I guess, in defense of some reporters, maybe they don't know what to call it because those lines are getting really blurry. But the only fingers we can really point are at bad policies that force shop owners into having to diversify their portfolio and having to move into these other spaces. And then what do you call your shop? Joe's Vape Shop is now Joe's Vape / hemp / THC / glass shop. And it's like, that's just too much to put on a sign.
Yeah.
Joe's alternative wares, I don't know what we call that shop. That's becoming much more common.
Jacob, do you know if anything changed with the law after the Eric Garner incident with the Lucy sales? Did they keep that law? Is that still something that they're doing?
Yeah, it was just driven by taxes more than anything. So yeah, I don't think there's been any change.
And you don't see any like social justice thing going on with that.
Yeah,
you see a lot of social justice things going on with that, but it's not.
It just goes away.
The connection, and I don't think we should be asking like Black people or like Black Lives Matter to deal with this, because this is not that issue. But what we should be asking is for the privileged people in tobacco control, who we actually have an audience with at certain times, at least to just think about what it is that they are doing and not make it so easy for them to. And I think that's also not very, it's not as effective, honestly, coming from white people. But like at a certain point, I don't think these people have had to think about the consequences of their actions and the way that they've gone. And I think that I think a lot of them would read Jacob's article or a similar argument like that and say that could never be us, and that's not what we want, and that won't happen. And I think that they shouldn't be allowed to think that, because I think there's countless examples from history of us doing things thinking we're protecting, and especially like the rank and file thinks you're protecting, and like that's just the system you're in, when really it causes harm. And I mean, Alex, you said you were trying to get away from saying should, and ultimately I think what the situation we're in is a should situation. It's a political situation. You know, there are questions of what's the best metric for finding out if prohibition works or something like that. But there's also just the question of, and I think with nicotine, this is quite pertinent, you know, when something is not causing a great deal of harm, and when there isn't sort of, I mean, yeah, there were prohibition with, you know, domestic violence, for example, which is also caused by things that are not alcohol, but it's certainly exacerbated when alcoholism is like part of that. But nobody, you know, nicotine doesn't end up in violent behavior. It doesn't end up in, it's a fine drug on its own. Cigarettes are a problem, but when we make nicotine the problem and then use prohibition as a way to deal with it, why? Like, it's just not that it's just not that dangerous. And I think that does get down to a political question. Like, why is it okay to restrict the use of something by a person who is really not affected? You can't make a secondhand smoke argument for this. You can't make, or like for a cigar bar or something like that, when everyone is just there, they're all doing the same thing. And there's really like, there's not even sort of the weakest argument. They don't have that available to them. And so that's where I'm just sort of, it gets very frustrating with people who are quote unquote pro harm reduction within the tobacco control field, who still sort of favor using the law as the tool to deal with the health problems of smoking, or the injustice of like the fact that, you know, the only people that still smoke cigarettes are largely poor, and like all of that kind of stuff. Like, it's just, I think they need to be asked that should question.
Yeah, you've inspired several questions here, and one of the things I sort of had going into some of y'all's comments was, you know, kind of dovetailing off of what you had said, Amelia, about kind of the numbers and the very almost objectifying way that people are looking at, or that researchers in tobacco control are looking at the data. You know, you have a really good quote in here, Jacob, from Ethan Nadelman, talking about how it seems that both tobacco control and harm reduction proponents have just sort of become comfortable with working in an illicit or gray market, and it's that sort of objectification of us in a way makes it easier to maybe take or maybe not quite torture. You have to torture the data in order to get to your conclusion. But one of the topics that came up in response to your article is this idea that alcohol prohibition was actually a good thing. And you know, we've been talking a little bit about how it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to get an accurate read on how much, you know, use prevalence or you know, sales of alcohol, or in our case, what we're talking about now, it would be sales of vapor products. And so, you know, are these folks actually torturing the data and trying to fit it to their narrative? Or is this really a timely call to go back and reevaluate the alcohol prohibition and see whether or not there was this net benefit?
I mean, I think it is good to reevaluate alcohol prohibition, but I think the thing that doesn't get brought up enough in discussions of that is that there was a better alternative at the time, and that prohibition didn't last pretty much anywhere that tried it. You know, lots of countries, lots of states tried alcohol prohibition, and they all rolled it back in pretty short order. And what actually lasted was more the Swedish model. In Sweden was right there from the beginning to just regulate alcohol and make it, somewhat less widely available and served a little bit more responsibly. And that's more or less what, became, more common, post-Prohibition, when we had control states created and different regulations put in place on drinking and when you can serve. So even if you want to rehabilitate Prohibition a little bit, I think the argument that should always be on the table is that we could have saved a lot of these downsides if we just tried the smarter policy from the beginning.
And
I always wonder, I'm someone who went through a 12-step program, and just sort of adding more to the, the data is not complete. Alcoholics Anonymous was founded because people needed a safe place to go and address their issue with, problematic drinking. And so when people talk about reporting, the consequences of prohibition or reporting use or the ill effects of excessive alcohol use, how many people we saw this with the lung injury cases. It was stark for those of us who understand that people are going to not disclose their substance use for fear of persecution or prosecution, or both. And so it's, again, maybe I'm making a point here and not asking a question, which is, it's incredibly difficult to get an accurate read on these things because it was illegal. People were stigmatized and pushed to the margin of society. And so we don't really know that. I mean, even if you're just, again, torturing the data and looking at one metric, which would be use prevalence, or even diseases. There's a study that was linked in this Vox article talking about maybe we need to, reconsider our opinion about prohibition.
Which I just shared in the chat, the article that Alex was talking about.
Yeah, some good resources there. Cases of cirrhosis went down during alcohol prohibition, and as Amelia noted, incidents of domestic violence went down. But doesn't seem to be violent crime also went down, and there are a lot of things that we, I think, sort of intuitively look at and say, well, organized crime was flourishing and making tons of money off of this. States weren't collecting the tax revenue. There's a large net cost there. And of course, all of the violations of people's agency and civil liberties that go along with that. Trying to quantify that seems like seems difficult to me, and in being able to show the cost and benefit of alcohol prohibition and expanding that. So I mean, we know that the drug war is absolutely harmful. There's no upside there, and that's not based on a comparison with alcohol prohibition. That's real world data. That's mass incarceration. It's the racism built into the policy. We know all of those things are bad and leading to negative outcomes. But in a way, I mean, nicotine is a little bit different. And I'm sorry I'm meandering and just probably not keeping things coherent here. But one of the questions I had was about drug silos. And, let's pretend for a moment that there was a net benefit of alcohol prohibition. Comparing drugs prohibition and alcohol prohibition, is there an argument to continue siloing off these different substances, or does it make more sense to treat all drugs under a very similar, outside of manufacturing or product standards, in a very similar regulation?
Outside of product and manufacturing standards? I mean,
obviously, for each product, there are issues of quality, supply chain, purity, and so on. Those are going to be different for different products.
I think that, in the world that I would like to live in, governments and government agencies would exist to make sure that products are safe, that there aren't malign incentives, that whether that's like in any market, I'm pro-government, full disclosure, not a libertarian, not any, I think that regulation can be good when it is good. And I would like to know that anything I put into my body or on my skin or in my house is not going to, poison me or give me a rash or fall on me or whatever. Aside from that, no, I don't think that and this is again more of a political argument. I don't know about policy effectiveness or whatnot, but I just don't think it's fundamentally fair to, judge the kinds of drugs people use. I think if you can make everything, so in that extent, yeah. So on the technical level, of course, we are going to need to treat these things differently because they're different. But I don't see a reason why we need to be, say, harsher on one drug than another in terms of the legality and this and that. Like, as long as, you can make it so that people can safely access it and whatever. No, I think I don't know. This is my sort of rambly, incoherent way of saying that we should not pick and choose our drugs, and there shouldn't be these silos. And I think from a strategic point of view, there shouldn't be. But also, the system that was going against illegal drugs, illicit drugs recently is changing its orientation towards this one, and they are going to merge and this and that. Like, this is the thing. Like, people, when something becomes kind of ineffective, they will move on to a new target. And I think that what I would like to see happen more is for people to have a conversation about how this is like other forms of drug use and prohibition, but also be open to the fact that drugs that maybe we had heard a lot of like propaganda about or, might not have a high opinion of, how, like, I think that vapors should think more about how they treat other drugs. Like, watch how you say things like, well, it's not like cocaine or heroin, as if those are the bad ones and this is the good ones. Because at the end of the day, when you're talking about illicit drugs, you're talking about a poisoned market. And there are ways to do those drugs safely. It's just, there's not an opportunity to do them safely anymore. And, that's where you get into kind of problems. And that's where the scary thing with us is. And I mean, the other thing, I know that this was a huge problem during alcohol business, or alcohol prohibition, but there's a poison drug supply then. And the very existence of a small one alone is enough for me to say that didn't work, because I just don't think it's ever okay to have a poison supply of something that doesn't have to be poison in the way that it is. But yeah, I mean, I think Jacob's point too, by the way, on prohibition working versus not working, the best metric to me is like fact. And the fact is they repealed it very early. It objectively did not work. Like, it did not work. It's gone. A working policy stays. So how are you going to get it to stay? More enforcement, more violence, more whatever. So, anyway.
Yeah. And one point I've tried to bring up before, and I think I tried to put it in an article once and my editor spiked it, but I think it's still a good point, was that talking about this issue of poison or toxic supply, which people who follow drug policy are familiar with. I think we should bring up that that's essentially what the government is doing when it bans vaping. Like, if you ban vapor products, you are essentially poisoning the supply of nicotine by putting people onto combustible tobacco. And nobody thinks about it that way because smoking predates vaping, but that's essentially what you're doing, is telling people who were getting a fairly safe source of nicotine that they now have to turn to something that's much more likely to kill them. And I think it's a parallel that doesn't get brought up very often.
And for that matter, people who, because the kids, I know the kids are a problem, but kids try things. and we're also saying, by phasing this out, because that's ultimately what this can do to this new market, is that we would prefer that the next generation of nicotine users only have access to the most dangerous things. And that to me is just absolutely bonkers. And I don't see how anyone could accuse me of endorsing youth vaping by saying that, just by not even accepting the fact that people you know, are going to use a drug because it has benefits to them. And if you're just going, yeah, that's exactly what they're doing. Like they're poisoning the market. And that is, it's hard to, but it's again, hard to make that argument when you have a very well-funded and really like skilled at certain areas of public relations like field that is kind of framing this another way and is very good at convincing the majority of people who do not use this specific drug right now because it has fallen out of vogue. It'll probably come back once it's like prohibited, but like convincing them that it's just, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really exist anyway right now. It's just mostly like an abstract threat to our children in the future unless we quash it right now. And because, you know, the people that vote, the people that have kind of control in this sort of scenario, the people that pay attention to these laws and maybe could get them to stop if they upset them, like they don't know people who smoke, and yeah, or they don't know their kids smoke or whatever. Yeah.
In that vein, a little bit, you know, there's this iron rule of prohibition. That, you know, the more restrictive the policies, the stronger the illicit substances get. And one of these, this may be a better question for, you know, Colin Mendelsohn or someone from Australia, but one of these articles from Australia said that they had confiscated some illicit vapor products and tested them, and they were coming back 6% and as high as 10% nicotine concentration. I don't know about any of you, but vaping 100 milligram nicotine is not necessarily pleasant. You don't, it's not an all day vape kind of thing. So, you know, really, my question is in y'all's travels, have you come across people who are selling or talking or demanding these very, very high nicotine concentration vapor products? And as another angle to this, I think you mentioned this in your article, Jacob, was that, you know, synthetic nicotine was sort of that response to that's part of the iron rule response to the FDA's horrible regulation of these products. I mean, is it limited? Is it going to be limited to synthetic nicotine, or should we really be worried about people trying to promote very high nicotine content stuff?
That's beyond my range. I don't know what the market demand is like for very high concentration nicotine.
I mean, just the way so this is something that's happened in Australia. To get
allegedly.
Well,
I probably should have framed that with like, we don't have any
part of me
confirmation.
wonders, like, I don't know, do you know what kind of device it was for starters? Because what I could see happening is in a place where you cannot, like, there's not even really a gray market there. They don't have vape shops or anything like that. And when you have people that are ordering nicotine in bulk from like other countries that would normally go into, say, like, you know, like
DIY.
It could be just bad mixing. And it's very plausible to me that a kid could like F that up, or that an adult could screw that up. They don't have an accurate enough scale or anything like this. I mean, I don't know how easy it would be to vape it. I think it would be an interesting experiment to see like how much can you vape of this.
It would keep you on your butt.
Because I don't think it would be that dangerous, because I think you'd throw up before.
Titration seems to be on the human side more than anything there.
He uses 55 milligrams, so, you know.
Yeah, I will tell you from personal experience. I will tell you from personal experience. First of all, I used to vape anywhere from 35 to 50 milligrams per milliliter in a sub-ohm rebuildable tank. And I also spoke to someone who had disclosed or confessed that they themselves keep a bottle of, you know, unflavored, essentially 100 milligram nicotine base in their drawer, and every now and then take a puff off of it. And I decided to try that for myself, and I will tell you, man, it works. But it's not something I'm going to puff on all day long. No. I certainly wouldn't.
I like to be vaping like 78% of the time, and I couldn't do that if I was. But yeah. I mean, so a commenter just said, like, I think there's the other explanation here is that they bungled the test, which is also quite plausible. So
or these are just stories of, you know, drug hysteria and things like that.
But quite honestly, in a place where the only supply is concentrated bottles of nicotine that need to be diluted by the user, I do find it absolutely believable that users are getting the concentrations wrong. If they're that high, I mean, yeah, maybe that is a person that just like occasionally puffs it, and if you can titrate it, to me, I don't know the like the vape that you take a puff of that makes you puke. Like there's obviously a level of that. I think we've got it with gum, because gum you can get like pretty sick.
Too much of it,
yeah, right. But
swallowing it though,
with vaping, it usually isn't effective enough in terms of like I just don't know.
I can completely see also that it's just, I've seen so many articles, news articles, and Jacob's probably seen this too, where people have, they don't know what they're looking at. You'll see pictures of like a bunch of cannabis stuff and they'll say these jewel pods, and you're like, what? You know, the people who are doing the raids and stuff, it's the same thing as with the fentanyl thing where, you know, oh, you can die if you get one little touch of it, you know, and so they see something that's actually something for DIYing and they go, oh my God, they're vaping this, you know, because they don't know what they're looking at, because so many times lawmakers and people just have shown that they have no clue how any of this works by calling it oil or saying electronic smoking device, or, you know, I've seen so many weird things that they think that there's tobacco in it, and people just, they have no clue what they're legislating or what they're policing, you know.
And I mean, I think it's not really a silver lining or anything, and I just like knock on wood, because anything can happen at any point that can change things in a market, and we saw that with cannabis. Like cannabis is like the safest drug in the world, and all of a sudden people start dying from it. But at least with vaping, it makes, if you have a super high nicotine vape, I just there's a mechanism that, and it is in the delivery mechanism, that would stop you from doing much damage to your body before that happens. But so I've seen like a comment from Michelle there where, you know, the response is to increase the level of the drug, you know, if I can only, like, if I have to spend $50 for like a pod, then yeah, I want that pod to be pretty high. Like maybe I will like use a bit, but it's just, that's sort of the problem. I don't think that that's going to cause vaping to be more, it'll be more dangerous if somebody like accidentally ingests it, or like your pet or your child or something like that. But I think for the user, it's just going to be very unpleasant. But again, you know, like what else do you do? Like I could certainly see like high nicotine starting to be a bit of a problem when nicotine is hard to get.
Oh, Jim said something about that. Where was that?
Oh,
Here.
Jim said, yes, Michelle.
Oh, hold on. This one.
This one. Okay.
Yeah, Jim McDonald, he's one of our directors. He says, yes, 100 milligram per milliliter DIY base is banned or taxed to death. We'll see some people buying pure, like 1,000 milligram nicotine from China. It's available. If you accidentally vape that, you might die. Okay,
so there, Jim knows the accidental vaping dying. Like I believe that. Yeah, if you put in, but I'm coming to that just as a user, coming to those kind of decisions on my own now with like, we've got a flavor ban coming up and this crazy tax and all of this crap. And I've got some DIY nicotine downstairs, and it's just sort of, you know, what do I do to sort of prepare for this? Would I rather be like vaping something that's regulated and whatever? Do I want like a bottle of poison in my basement right now? Not exactly. But I also don't want to use cigarettes. So, and I like nicotine and I find nicotine helpful. So I'm going to do it in the way that's safe for me. Now, if we do that on a mass scale, if everybody that wants to use nicotine has to buy something that like you need to put gloves on and have like a special to the like whatever milligram scale in order to use it, are there going to be accidents and injuries and death and harm that you wouldn't otherwise have? Of course you will. Like, of course you will.
Yeah.
I also liked in Jacob's article where he talks about the fact that people use nicotine because they like it, not just because they're addicted. And that's one thing that's bugged me all the time, is that you don't immediately become dependent on nicotine the first time you use it. There's something that brings you back to it. You're like, oh, kind of like, hey, I really like cigars, or I really like cognac, or I really like wine, or any other drug too, you know, cocaine or cannabis. You know, some people like the high of cocaine. Some people like the low of cannabis, that, you know, that more mellow thing. I'm not really into either one of them. I'm not a big drinker, but I like my nicotine. And I would go out drinking just so I could smoke more, because I liked smoking. I really did. And I had 3 kids, and I quit through all my pregnancies and nursing and still started again. So clearly it wasn't just because of the nicotine that I wanted that cigarette. That hand mouth thing is big for me. And so that, I think that attitude of we're all just, well, like the whole slave term, you know, that we're all slaves to this, and they change how they present us too. You know, kids are in danger of this lifetime of addiction. We have to save them, and they won't be able to control themselves. And now we're adults and we use nicotine, and you're just a dirty addict. You know, now you're just this, you know, all the empathy and sympathy disappears as soon as you're an adult. You know, so it's this horrible addiction as if you're a kid, and we have to save them of this lifetime of addiction. And then you're an adult and, you know, well, you know, just quit. I just saw one in Massachusetts. You know, some guy said that, just, you know, I'm sorry if we're taking away all of your products, but we have to save the children from this horrible addiction. And my message to adults is just quit. You should just quit.
And I mean, the one thing that I sort of gleaned from watching, listening, speaking to some of the people that have that, like, say, these people don't care about kids. They actually, like, really, there is a bit, one of the things that really fascinated me during the whole, like, Juul thing and all this, and it was all of a sudden very focused on kids, was they didn't care about kids. And what they did care about was kids that were acting out. And I mean, in this case, it happened to be, like, at least at first, a lot of rich kids. And then the solution was to put a bunch of cops in schools of kids that weren't rich and make their lives suck and make their teachers' lives suck. But I mean, that's the one thing that, like, you don't have to accept from these people, tobacco-free kids. We don't have to accept from them they speak for children, because you're a mother, and because children are part of our community, and because, you know, like, these people don't speak for every kid, and some of their policies are actually ending up very shitty for kids right now. And I think you know, I don't think it's necessarily a pro-child policy to, like, it's like when you had to save kids from rock and roll, or when you had to save them from weed. And in any of those situations, if you look back on it, what you see is actually, you know, a cultural struggle. It's often a cultural struggle between, like, older people and younger people. And something younger people is doing is really getting under the skin of older people, and they respond. But also, like, just while I have the opportunity, I would like to say, like, I think the first thing I read by Jacob, like, it was so great to have a voice in this space talking on this issue. And I don't know how much you knew about the product themselves at the time, but to have someone that understood the politics of it and also didn't dismiss agency and just the fact that there is something people like about smoking or vaping or anything. And I think that that's just a complete blind spot to the other smart voices that speak on this. And it's very hard to to even bring that back into the discourse without getting, shit flung at you, and being accused of like ridiculous things, even though it's just sort of your experience. It's what or you've talked to someone, it's what you know. So that was really refreshing for me to sort of read somebody that was just sort of interested in looking at this objectively, but without sort of objectifying and projecting all this subjective weird like hoo-ha onto this. Like I'm glad you've stuck around, man.
Yeah, me too. And protecting kids has turned into tasing them and strip searching them.
Right. And which I think gets, again, if you want to talk about like objective, subjective, fact, emotion, this and that, if you're tasing a child, you cannot pretend to care about the child. Period. Like, it's for your own good.
Yeah. Yeah, I got to go pick my own Switch as a kid for my own good, Did me a world of wonder. I do want to say on the topic of prohibition, the iron law of prohibition, and I've said, on this program and across the Twitterverse, whatever, that when it comes to vaping, when it comes to e-liquid, there aren't very incentives to reduce cost in a lot of ways. PG, VG flavoring, these things are widely available. They cost almost nothing. We saw with the introduction, during the lung injuries, we saw vitamin E acetate being introduced to cut things. Drugs are cut with all sorts of low cost, supplies, whatever materials to reduce cost. We don't see that a lot with vaping because everything costs so little, but the further the more heavily we tax nicotine, this conversation of high nicotine levels raises a lot of questions, I guess, with me as far as, at what point will, the market, the people decide like these products are not satisfying. They don't satisfy me. I instantly throw up. I can't use them. That's going to have a reflection on the supply with any market. Typically that supply would adjust accordingly and bring those levels back down. So that way they continue to sell their products. Hopefully that's what happens if we do see nicotine go up through the roof. But a more recent concern that I didn't really acknowledge, I guess, before is, and Jim kind of made a point of this. I don't know where his comment went, but along the sweet spot of, or maybe it was Michelle who had made a point to this. Either way, with the flood of disposables that we're seeing come from China and other places, it's really the safety standards of these products that are starting to concern me, and how cheaply and poorly they're made, the heating elements that are being used, the wicking materials that are being used, all of these things that we don't actually know much about right now. The tried and true metals that we've used as heating elements, or materials we've used as heating elements that have shown not to cause very much harm, or the wicking materials that we use in high quality, these products, that's going to the wayside. And we're starting to see a whole mess of other things, batteries that are just kind of openly connected inside these devices, and there's no real safety put into them. It's just an inhale on-off switch on a raw lipo shoved into a disposable. There's just some random foam in there that what are these products being made out of it? And I guess that's where my concerns with this market going illicit was really focused on the social interactions of people, where people are going to buy these products, not having the safety net of buying them from a shop where there's cameras, there's enforcement, there's things that can be done if you're sold a bad product, whatever. Those go away immediately when you get onto the illicit market. When you get into somebody's back seat to buy drugs and then you get thrown out at 30 miles an hour, speaking from experience, you don't have much safety net there. You don't really have anybody to go to. Am I going to go to the cops? Hey, my drug deal went bad. Can you help me? Like, that doesn't work. So
I think
when we're moving into this is kind of where my concerns are shifting. Like, I still have a lot of concern about that, how and where people are going to buy their products. But now my concerns really are like, we don't know how safe some of these things are, and the quality control, none of that's there. No, what are your guys' concerns? Is that a concern for you
And
guys?
Jim has a question for you too.
Like,
Well,
I didn't vape in 2009. But I spent a lot of time reading everything everyone who was vaping in 2009, 2010, 2008 wrote to each other. And those were the concerns, whether or not they were warranted at the time. Those were a lot, like, people were concerned, especially at the very beginning. Like, what is this that I am using? And I think by accident in some way of like history and technology, it turned out that it was kind of safe. And I think we're kind of going back to that time where there's uncertainty. So Jim's question, which like, I think that I don't have the answer. Maybe Logan does. It was asked to him anyway, but just the idea of like, do we have evidence that there's like massive safe products out there? Yeah. And I would agree with Jim here. Like, we don't, it will keep vaping widely available. The problem that we have, though, is that like, if there is an unknown or if there is something, and this isn't really like, it's not like, this is more just like just within family, it's something vaping should think about, is the fact that, you know, this was a much smaller thing when it started out, and there was a very strong online community started by somebody who was a vapor, or multiple online communities started by people who were vapors on separate platforms that were not policed by, you know, morals and norms and like public crises about like letting too many Nazis on and like whatever. So they were able to talk this shit out and have a safe market by virtue of having consumers sort of police the great dealer, like all of this kind of stuff. And now we're going back to that time, but this has grown enough that people are not going to go back onto like ECF and stuff like that. Like, it's just not going to happen.
Sure. I guess one of my points is, to answer Jim, I guess, you know, where I've seen it, I don't have really evidence, but I've seen recent, you know, teardowns of some of the you know, extremely cheap disposables that are being produced overseas and that are coming over here. And it kind of reminds me of like, you know, the days of blue aquarium foam. There's a reason we moved past blue aquarium foam, Jim. You know, there's concerns there. There's better quality materials that we know are not going to add on any additional health risks, albeit they're probably low to begin with. But why add on additional health concerns to products when we could simply regulate them? You know what I mean? Like, I guess I just do have concerns with how low a quality some of these products are going to get and how dangerous they may become the further that we move down this line. Right now, widely available illicit disposables or whatever that are on the market, sure, maybe they're fine, but is there going to come a point where we go, how cheap can we really make these?
Well, and how do we respond as people that have been speaking for vaping? How do we respond to that possibility? Because it can't just be, and we're all worried about it too, because we're users, right? But I think that, you know, if it continues to move towards prohibition in the way that it's doing, I think obviously you have to sort of fight that and you have to do the sort of legislative thing. But I think groups like CASAA will have to continue to focus and perhaps emphasize even more. And I don't know how you'll do it because you don't have a lot of funding and you don't have a lot of people. And I'm not, but I think that the vaping community in general, like, we are going to have to also find ways to make sure that information can get out to new users and to people, like, of how to do a thing safely. And I think we all sort of take it for granted, back with the blue aquarium foam and stuff, that we didn't end up keep doing somewhat dumb things that people might have thought was okay at the time. But we're like kind of moving back to that stage, but we've got more of like a hornet's nest of it's like you can't just talk to one audience anymore. And so how do we make sure that this stays safe even when it's illicit, as we fight for it not to be? And I do think that's a legitimate concern. I don't like the black market argument being used as a scare tactic, because I do think at the end of the day, like, those dangers don't exist right now here. And I think it kind of allows the enemy or like the people trying to, like, it can empower them to be like, look at how much scarier this is than we actually even thought. But at the same time, the market, you don't want it to turn into a market where like consumers need to control what they see. Like how do you kind of keep this so there's not too much uncertainty, and so there's no differentiation between safe and dangerous. And like I just don't want people to die. And again, like I do think back to the vitamin E acetate, and I know that doesn't work with vaping products, but in theory there could be something that does, that has a similar thing, and it could be quite innocent how it gets in there, and it could do damage. And that's where it scares me that a lot of vaping conversations sort of happen on forums like Facebook, like the private ones or the in-group ones, Facebook, Reddit, places that can ban like that whole group, and then you lose all this knowledge. So I just sort of wonder if this goes back to like, and you build your own coils and you're making your own e-liquid and you're finding your own wicks. Like, where is the resource for people so they know that they can't just put the blue aquarium foam in there, or like, you know, fiberglass or whatever the hell people are going to do.
I know what you're saying, but we've got to keep in mind that for years, excuse me, before the FDA even got involved, we were finding things out and doing research, and we had gotten a pretty safe product figured out before FDA even got involved. You had things like blue foam and things like that, but you know, ironically, people were seriously looking into what the stuff was made of, what happens when it gets to a certain temperature. I mean, people were researching stuff before they used it. So it's not like they were just randomly throwing, I mean, I'm sure some people were, but by the time FDA got involved, we had a pretty good product that was pretty darn safe. I mean, they had already discovered diacetyl, however people say it, you know, the popcorn lung stuff. They'd already figured it out, pretty much self-regulated most of it out of the products. I mean, so this idea that the black market was so much worse, yeah, it is. It is a false kind of flag, whatever you want to call it, because we had nobody died vaping in those years before FDA got involved. And that was something I was thinking too, when you were saying earlier about how food, you know, how you want you want regulation because you want to know that your food is safe and your medicines are safe and your stuff you put in your skin is safe. And I kind of chuckled to myself because I thought FDA doesn't work that way. FDA,
I don't have the FDA.
Like, I'm just saying that they, you know, FDA and most of these regulatory, we've seen how they work. Basically, it's, yeah, go ahead, do what you're going to do. You kind of gave us a 3-week study, and now go ahead and sell whatever. And then if something happens, then we'll address it. And that's pretty much what they do. And that's what they should be doing with vaping. If nobody's really getting hurt, why can't they say, okay, we know what's in it. We don't want you to put like diacetyl in it because we don't like that. Don't put vitamin E acetate in it because we've already discovered that. But go out and sell it and let's see what happens. And then, because that's what they do with everything else. But with vaping, it's got to be 100% safe, even though we had this market for like a decade almost before FDA got involved, that nobody got hurt from vaping.
I mean, my only like comment on that would be that just the genesis of vaping is that most of the products used in the technology were reappropriated from something else and were already highly regulated downstream, like propylene glycol, extremely regulated product, not expensive, not like whatever, even nicotine, like you just happen to find like flavorants, they're not that regular, but they are, right? Like it was stuff that was already available to consumers. Whether it was marketed to consumers is another question, but it was very downstream. Like we're not doing anything, like we're repurposing batteries and flashlights or this or that. And so, you know, my main concern just with bringing that up again, because I do think that is the key, is no one did, like it worked out quite well. But I think one of the reasons it worked out quite well is there was a smaller community of people working on a problem together and solving it and making sure, and that this wonderful wealth of knowledge and science was like left behind in the traces because of the way it was done. It was done online. And the platforms that people go to now to do that do not have that same kind of archiving effect. And what does worry me is that if this goes completely underground, that knowledge becomes lost and we get less control over the market as we did before, when it was still a gray market, but there were fewer of us, manufacturers were listening to us, and it becomes quite, I don't think it's never a situation where a person who sells drugs or a company who sells drugs or like drug sellers want to kill their customers or anything like that. But it becomes much harder to sort of informally keep things safe in the absence of regulation. So I actually agree 100% with you, Kristen, that like, yeah, why can't you just let it happen and let it happen safely and nobody, and I think that would be the best thing to do. But what I do worry about is with this generation of people who have now started on things like what I'm using, which is just like it's just so idiot proof. And then you have to kind of go back to a foreign thing. And, where are the resources going to be if like they continue to crack down on things like vaping groups on Facebook? Like, I know kids aren't going to go to Facebook, but like, you know what I'm saying? Like, where is the network to make sure that as you do this, you don't do something by accident that's dumb, and that dumb thing doesn't grow into a thing that becomes normal
already. Yeah, I see what you're saying, but what we saw already was what happens with that. Look what happened with cannabis vapes and vitamin E acetate. Yes, some people got hurt and stuff like that, but the system worked there. They traced it down, they figured it out, and now they don't allow that in the vapes. So why can't they do the same thing with these nicotine vapes? Like you said, it's already based on everything they're already familiar with, and they've got all these decades of very few, if any, I mean, there's been not a single death from vaping, from, as opposed to smoking, if you use it as directed or how intended, it could kill you. Whereas with vaping, people using it as directed, as intended, and the poisonings we've had have been kids drinking, DIY liquid and stuff like that, or batteries being exploding that weren't charged properly, or the wrong batteries. There's going to be, nothing's 100% safe. But the same thing. They already know everything that's in these. Just like with food, we've got a ton of familiarity with it. So you put it on the market because you've got over a decade of proof of concept, basically, right now. So just approve them and then let them. Then if something comes up, and you do like you did with the.
Because they don't want you to vape. They don't want us to vape.
Sorry. Yeah, I want to jump in and try to kind of attempt to answer your question a little bit, Kristen. You brought something. I mean, people have talked about this. I know Clive Bates has brought this up. Other friendly experts in the field have brought it up, that the appropriate way to go about this is to allow it on the market and take action if something comes to the surface, and we need to clamp down here. I think Scott Gottlieb, in a way, it's as if he tried to check that box on his way out the door. And this was, I think, some of his interview on the New York Times piece about Juul, the Sheila Kaplan's greatest hits. It was that, they came out with this 2017 guidance, or they're, sort of rejiggering their mission a little bit to regulate nicotine instead of just thinking about tobacco. And they felt that this was an appropriate way forward. And then within a year or so of making this statement or releasing this guidance, the youth thing went out of control. And one of the things that you bring up in the article, Jacob, was, that the abstinence-only mindset in the U.S. has led to misinformation promoted by alarmist media coverage, and so on. I think you maybe went a little bit of different direction there, but in a way, they've sort of taken advantage of that. They have constructed this weird, not quite reality where, well, we did do that. We did let the vapor companies go do their thing, and then the kids started using it, so we had to take action. It's not specific to any quality control issues, but more of that they, which I think is on par with misinformation, and it's a false narrative. It's because we've been trying to, really, I think, put the youth use numbers into context, but it's not getting out to the rest of the world, and we are panicked by the campaigns and so on. But that was my stab at that, and I don't know if, Jacob, you have a different view on that, or a different take, or any more.
No, I think that was a good summary of how how things happened during that period.
It's so crazy, and so much prohibition seems to be supported by the whole Save the Children thing and false narratives and blowing out the numbers and just blatant. I mean, the only thing I can think of that I can compare tobacco control is flat earth believers. You know, they only see what they want to see, and they completely dismiss any science that's put in front of them and say, but what about, but I feel, but it's only what I can see is what counts. You know, it just makes me crazy that these people are in power. And I love what you said before, Amelia, about, and I had never thought of that, about how these people in tobacco control weren't really under a microscope. Everybody just kind of trusted them and said, yeah, they're good people. They're doing the Lord's work, basically, to put it that way. And you're right. They aren't used to people suddenly going, wait, you're doing what? You're saying what? You know, let me see the science a little bit closer. What do you mean seizures? What do you mean? You know, like the one that just came out of Australia was ridiculous. That whole review of the science, and it's definitive now that vaping is not better than smoking, and that it's causing kids to smoke. And if you get down and read what they're reviewing, it's ridiculous. You might want to look into that one, Jacob.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. I'll check that out.
I mean, just quickly, one of the things that I would like to say, I mean, coming into this space again, like from an academic position, and learning the history of vaping and the vaping community and their encounter with the people that were responsible for studying smoking and dealing with smoking, there was a real sort of betrayal of trust and something like I don't know that you can really pin it down in like an IRB regulation, but I would say like just a very unethical relation. And it was people who really sort of trusted, as we're told to do, is trusted the scientists. Now, there's some question to me as to like whether that's the right term for some of these people, but you know, there was a genuine trust and belief, and I think that was taken advantage of, and I think really the field kind of has to own that, even the ones who are friendly to this now. And honestly, all of people like academia, people that get paid to be objective and to learn things and whatever, I think that's kind of on institutions as a whole. We have these departments where the norms are so wildly different from what we would consider to be good inquiry. And I think ultimately, like, that's one of the things that's kind of soured me on this, and I probably need to get past it. But I do think that it's just, I hate sort of seeing that the expertise associated with this and the expert field, to a certain extent, didn't know what they were talking about from the beginning, and that the people that do and did and whatever, that it kind of turned them against each other. Because I think that's one of the things that I still love vaping because of it, but made me want to study it, was like I saw a whole field of people that were working on a problem and solving it in a way that was not any different than great laboratories and whatever, but it was a bunch of users, and the science and the inquiry that went on to end up in what we have now it's just so rare to see that in the making, and that even happens. And it just kind of sucks that's so discredited, and that the people that really could have been wonderful collaborators, had they been able to see this in a different way and had they had better incentives, that those people ended up kind of taking this towards a different direction, and that it's, you know, a bit of a shit show now. Sorry. But
well, with that, I think we kind of need to wrap this up. I am still going to do a very brief legislative rundown here, but I want to give our guests the last word. So if there's anything that we didn't cover or perhaps needs a little bit more expanding on, Jacob, since it's your article that we've been was
He's been kind of quiet.
for this.
Yeah, no, I think we covered a lot. You know, and I'm potentially working on a new piece on this, but one thing I think we should start focusing on is just we're used to talking about vaping and tobacco harm reduction purely through a public health lens, and I think in the next year and beyond, as these more restrictive policies come into play, we need to start talking about it as a criminal justice issue too, and because in part because, one, that's very true, and it's a problem that we're going to face, that the arrests and prosecutions are already happening, But also, I think it just reaches a bigger audience. As somebody mentioned earlier, I think in the chat, there just aren't a lot of vapors, statistically speaking. And so, it's hard to get attention for what we talk about. But criminal justice is a really important issue in the United States, and people want to talk about it. So if we can make these connections to the past failures of the drug war and prohibition and how we're headed down the same path right now, we might be able to get more sympathy for what we're talking about.
Excellent.
Amelia, anything to add there to piggyback off of?
No, I mean, I can't say it any better than Jacob has just said it then, and I got my little speech in earlier. I think that that's exactly right. I mean, the only thing I would add to that too is like, and I don't think Jacob's doing this, but also that's such important work. And when we engage in it, I think we need to be really thoughtful about how we engage in it and not do to any community that we're reaching out to, not assume too much, right? Like as we move and make this bigger, we always need to be reminding ourselves to treat the people who we're going to try to ally with or who we want to learn about as we wish we might have been treated. And so really do, we're gonna start to get into territory that as like law-abiding normal people, or however we like to see ourselves, isn't going to be comfortable for everybody that vapes, and we're going to have to do some hard work of realizing we're not so different from people that have been really othered to us in the way that you might have been experienced being othered to other people. And so just, as we do this, like, it's not just about, it does have to be about criminal justice, but I think a lot of us that are in vaping, we all have a lot of learning to do on that, and I think we can do it, but it's not going to be easy, but it's really important, and that's kind of where we're going to have to go. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we probably have less learning to do about it than many of the people in tobacco control, though.
This is true. The bar is set quite low at this point.
All right. Well, before Alex gets into legislation, definitely want to thank both of you so much for joining us for this discussion this week. Excellent discussion, excellent article, Jacob. Love all the stuff you write, from books to articles to quick reads about mocktails. I don't know how familiar everybody is with all of Jacob's writings, but that's some of my favorite stuff. Is I just love the idea of mocktails. I don't know why. Anyways, thank you guys again so much. If you'd like to stick around, you absolutely can. You can hang out while Alex goes through our legislative rundown and what we're going to keep our eyes and ears on this week. If not, that's absolutely okay too. If you got other things going on, we've kept you now for almost 2 hours, so you both have
after her road trip.
You're more than welcome to move on. But thank you guys so much, absolutely. And Alex, if you are you ready?
I'm ready.
You're ready for the thing? All right, you guys, we're gonna do the thing. Let's do the darn thing.
All right.
All right, Alex, what do you got for us this week? What are we going to keep our eyes and ears on?
All right. So we'll go to the big map here eventually. We're going to start off in Colorado because alphabetical order. I think this is the same update from last week. There was a hearing held, and there at one point was an amendment that allowed for an exemption for adult-only establishments that would still be allowed to sell vapor products. But more powerful lobbies got involved here, and so the exemptions were limited to, I believe, hookah lounges. I think menthol might have even gotten a pass here. Don't quote me on that. You can, of course, go read the legislation for yourself if an updated version is available on Colorado's website, which, as far as I can tell, I didn't check it this morning. The last update to the bill that you can read was on March 18th. I guess I do still have to count the months on my hands. So this has been a heavily amended bill, and it is still in the House. The next step for this is the House Appropriations Committee. Not clear on what kind of testimony that committee will be taking, what will be relevant for their ears, but it is still moving through the process. That is HB 1064. So if you are in Colorado, by all means, send a message to your lawmakers in advance of the next hearing, and as many contacts as we can get with, encouraging lawmakers to oppose this, the better. Moving right along, Hawaii back in the spotlight this week. This is relatively urgent. I know that we've been keeping up with these bills in Hawaii. This is HB 1570. This is the one that is moving. For those who are not familiar with the process in Hawaii, but who may live there, there are a bill has to go through like a dozen committees before it does anything. There are all kinds of hearings. I think this has definitely had a few. This is kind of an abbreviated look at the history of the bill. But most recently, this week on the 7th, the Consumer Protection Committee and the Ways and Means Committee both made decisions on this. They passed the bill unanimously. And so what we're sort of accustomed to in other states is that would mean that this moves on to a vote by the full chamber. But what is actually happening here is that it's going to a conference committee. And so the window for submitting written testimony has closed. If you want to contact your lawmakers, if you want to make your voice heard, you got to write them. You got to write them. You got to make phone calls. There's no more opportunities to participate in a public hearing. And so it's really important that people do take advantage of this engagement on our website. And we also have the look up your legislators box here at the bottom. So once you've sent your message, scroll back up, look at the talking points that we've provided as a guide to help frame the comments that you might deliver on a phone call. But by all means, please make that phone call. Your voice, your literal voice, carries a lot more weight than one of our pre-written messages, of course, that we urge you to edit with your own personal story. And so I don't have a date yet, but we do have a general range here that at the end of April, this conference committee will be making a decision one way or another about this. So you've got a couple weeks to get your voices heard in Hawaii, and I strongly urge people to take advantage of that and do so. That is HB 1570 in Hawaii. Moving on to Rhode Island, some possibly good news. I don't want to oversell it one way or another because what has happened in Rhode Island is actually kind of common. There are 4 bills now in Rhode Island that is already living under a flavor ban by way of the health department rule. This, of course, would codify it in state law. These 4 bills received another hearing and were held for further study. This means it could just kind of languish in a limbo here for a little while until the session ends and nothing happens, or these bills could be called up at any time. So if you are in Rhode Island, it is absolutely fair game to continue sharing your stories with lawmakers and urging them to oppose these bills. And if you want extra credit that I'm not going to hand out, but just that little bit of self-satisfaction from knowing that you went the extra mile, you can always encourage them to repeal or take some action. I believe there was a bill in session last year that would have undone the health department's flavor ban that everyone in Rhode Island is currently living under. So that's the activity that we're covering. I'm sorry, these are 4 bills. I'm not going to read all of these bill numbers. If you live in Rhode Island, please check out our call to action. You get all the information that you need there. And so, as I was about to say, that is the legislative rundown for this week. And all of you appreciate me keeping that short.
In record time. Or at least it's close. I don't know. I don't keep track of the record times, but that was awfully quick, sir. That was awfully quick. And I don't know if quick is a good thing or a bad thing in these situations.
I'll take the win. It's a little bit of a win.
A little bit of a win, at least some reprieve in some form or fashion. Yes, I see a lot of thank yous from everybody in chat. Thank you guys. Thank you folks for tuning in, hanging out with us, being here for this conversation. I saw a lot of discourse over hookah in chat, and yeah, Jim is correct. Hookah is a deemed tobacco product. Shisha, which is a form of hookah tobacco. It's loose tobacco. It's very moist. It's often mixed with like fruits and spices and things like that. Yes, and yes, it does, at least to my knowledge, almost always or always contain nicotine. I don't know as though I've ever heard of nicotine-free hookah or shisha. But yeah, definitely a tobacco product for sure. So yes, thank you guys. Thank you everybody in chat. If you are not already a member of CASAA, please leave right now and head over to CASAA.org. Sign up. It's absolutely free. We won't spam you and fill your inbox with all sorts of unnecessary stuff, but you can get all the updates, all the calls to action, everything you need to stay involved, to get involved. You can also head over to our merch shop. Danielle Jones will yell at me if I don't talk about it because she worked so hard, and all of our merch is sweet. Go pick up some sweet swag, and you'll be a walking billboard for tobacco harm reduction. And it's a really cool, great way to support CASAA as well. And you can also donate all the cool things over at CASAA.org. For podcast listeners, there will be 2 versions of this episode. You can listen to the full version wherever you listen to your podcasts. There'll also be a real short, like just legislative rundown version of that, like 4.5 seconds of legislation that Alex just ran through. It's going to be a little bit longer than that, but that was super quick, man. I don't know. Is there anything I'm missing here?
I don't think so.
I think I got it. I think I did all the things. I think I got it.
Everybody. We told them where to go. We gave them the information.
I mean, that's basically what CASAA does. We tell you where to go. We give you the information.
Who do we have next week?
Who do we have next week, Kristen?
We have Dr. Brad Radu coming on the show next week.
And for anybody who missed it, we recently had Dr. Brad Radu on our CASAA Twitter space. If you're not familiar with that, follow us over on Twitter at CASAA Media. Every other Wednesday or so, we do a CASAA Twitter space, which is kind of like a live audio-only podcast that you can tune into, listen to. Is that you can tune into them on PC, but you can't.
Yeah, you can listen to Twitter Spaces on PC, but there's no way to make you a speaker, which is fine because we have guests.
See, I've never done anything regarding Twitter Spaces on PC. I almost never use Twitter on the Mac. It's almost always on my phone. But if you're on mobile, it's real easy. You can click the notifications for it when our tweets go out about it. So that way you get a nice little reminder of when we're going to be live, when you can tune in. That will be Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern for anybody who does want that heads up. I'm sure we'll have a tweet about it, announcing it soon. I don't know if we already have one out yet, but if not, it'll be out and available on the Twitterverse soon. You can click that little reminder bell. And while you're here, if you're on YouTube, if you're on Facebook, wherever you are, take a minute and click that little thumbs up for us. Give us a like. It really does help. And share it. Share this with everybody you know. Share it with your friends. Share it with your dog. Send it to random emails and phone numbers. Blast it out everywhere. Share it across the internet. I know. Please don't just send it to random numbers, or do. I can't condemn or condone it. So either way, that's going to do it for us this week. As far as I know, we will be back next Saturday.
Yeah, with Dr.
Brad. As long as the world doesn't fall apart and we can get Dr. Brad to figure out his microphone, we will be back. Sorry, Dr. Brad. We will be back next week, 4:30 p.m. Eastern, 1:30 over on the other coast, and you got to Google Foo it for anywhere in between. That's going to do it for us this week. Be excellent to each other, everyone. Stay safe out there. And that's it.
That's it.